Hey everybody. I said many moons ago that I would do a review on Real Boys. I had to go back through and review some of the things I've read and reread most of the book. And I decided I need to do 2 reviews on this thing because it's like 400 pages. But the thing is, it's got like specific studies that it refers to throughout the entire book of from different universities, a lot from Harvard, since William Pollack, the author, he's a Harvard guy, but so there's a lot of people associated with him or that he knows in this industry of psychology and parenthood and gender roles and different things. So there's a ton of very legitimate scientific study type material that they refer to in the book, and so it's a lot of fun to sort of break down a lot of these ideas. Now, I'm going to start the very first of the book. He goes through a lot of he kind of sets it up as like the boy code, okay? That there's this code for boys that we have sort of come to live by in Western culture, that boys need to detach from their parents early on and not express emotions other than anger and happiness, right? And so there's a lot of, it's okay to be very rambunctious and wild, and it's okay to be angry, but most other emotions are sort of off limits. And he talks about specific stories, right, of where we've sort of created this standard of detachment. Now, a lot of that is early on in childhood when a kid is going to go to preschool or kindergarten. It's just tear them from the parents. Parents make a quick run. The kids will cry, but they'll get over it. That's kind of what everyone says. They'll cry, but they'll get over it. But there's a lot of trauma that's associated with this whole they'll cry but they'll get over it thing. Now, some kids cope okay with it, but most don't. And it just depends on where they're at on their sort of this independence scale. And the problem is a lot of kids appear on the outwardly to be okay with complete independence, but that's because they're already conforming to the man code of I have no emotion, I'm impenetrable, right? So he shows through lots of studies and his own experience and things that children who are able to just detach on their own terms and on their own timeline are much more emotionally stable throughout life. So the parents who kind of stay and sit in the back of the classroom and their kid gets to kind of check in with them every once in a while and make sure mom's still there or dad's still there for me if I need them, but I'm doing okay for now, right? They kind of get to go through this scenario and piece by piece feel more comfortable with detachment and know that mom will return and it'll be good at the end of the day, right? The kids that are not, some of them, in the book, one story that he specifically refers to, the kids throwing up every day at the first of class. Now, this is these are telltale signs of true trauma. And people don't consider emotional things like that to be trauma, but they are, and they have the exact same signs and symptoms, right? So let me just get to reading the highlighted portions that I have, which are 1,000,000, which is why I've cut it into 2. While the significant gaps in girls' science and math achievement are improving greatly, boys' scores on reading are lagging behind significantly and continue to show little improvement. Recent studies also show that not only is boys' self-esteem more fragile than that of girls, and that boys' confidence as learners is impaired, but also that boys are substantially more likely to endure disciplinary problems. So the boys in society are being sort of shamed by classmates or whatever, and there's this, and boys will do anything to avoid shame. For some reason, they just have this I'll do anything not to feel ashamed of myself or whatever in public, right? And so they would rather act rambunctious and they don't care about school than get an answer wrong or whatever. And so it's easier to go be in trouble by the principal and gets suspended or whatever than to feel stupid in class. So some interesting dynamics. I'll discuss how and why society places boys in a gender straitjacket without being aware of doing so. Society is judging the behavior of boys against outmoded ideas and about masculinity and about what it takes for a boy to become a man. As early as age 5 or 6, many boys are pushed out of the family and expected to be independent in school, camp, at all kinds of activities and situations they may or may not be ready to handle. Give our boys in early adolescence a second shove into new schools, sports, competitions, jobs, dating, travel, and more. The problem is not that we introduce our boys to the world. That's what parents should be doing. It's how we do it. Okay, he says later on, because we believe that disconnection is important, even essential for a boy to make the break and become a man. It's sort of like built in. They need to like become the independent rock, so that later on he can maintain that for his own family or whatever. It's kind of crazy. I believe that boys feeling ashamed of their vulnerability mask their emotions and ultimately their true selves. Now, as a a male in this society, like I actually, my parents were very, very close to me and my grandparents and things, so I feel like I had very good role models in my life and things. But this is even bigger than family culture, right? I think family's the biggest influence, and so does he. But it's even bigger than family. And I went through a lot of the things that they're talking about, right? Like I put on a mask, and I'm sure every person, men and women, do this in some situations and things, right? But you learn like what mask is going to help you avoid certain types of shame or sadness or conflict or whatever. And I experienced a lot of this personally. So first of all, thank you, Mom and Dad, for being so awesome. But on with the book, right? I just realized, like, I really didn't worry about my hair today, did I? So, the lasting positive benefits of a close relationship with parents. Research actually shows that men who are able to develop their emotional lives more fully are physically and psychologically healthier than men who are not. For example, in a study conducted at Wellesley College, Roslyn found that young adult men with close relationships to their parents had lower levels of psychological distress. In addition, such men reported that they did not feel that their parents were too intrusive. It's better to be loved at an older age than abandoned at an early age. These are things like in Italy, right? They sort of have this like mama's boy culture that's like fostered. It's okay. And so being still attached to your mom, like older, in your 20s and 30s is totally fine. And these are some quotes that they said, right? It's better to be loved at an older age than abandoned at an early one. The problems come more from a lack of affection than an excess of it. You don't find people who are psychologically unbalanced because they got too much love or protection at home. And that's true. And several parts of this book, both when referring to mothers and fathers, you can't love your kids too much. Like, you can't show them enough or too much how you're just proud of them, you're super happy to be their parent, glad that they're your child, like, go explore the world, but if you ever need me, come back. I'm right here, I'm ready for you, right? I always am happy to see you and be with you and work through things with you. And so, like, you can't do that enough, or I mean too much, I should say. I believe most mothers and their sons are capable of creating strong, healthy relationships based instead on interdependence, the reconnection that each of us has ties to and relies on other people, but that each of us is also responsible for our own actions and selves. Parents simply need to be careful not to put their own needs and desires ahead of their sons, and not to attempt to manipulate his emotions, to guilt or shame him into doing what they want. The one thing that comes up with me as I read this book, And I actually experienced this in therapy, is where the kind of the idea started. But it's like you've got to you've got to hold yourself to a really high standard for certain things, and at the same time you got to give yourself a break. Like, you didn't have all the information, so you made a dumb decision, right? Same with parenting and children, right? We obviously all want our kids to exceed like everyone's expectations and be super great in every way, right? At the same time, we've got to give them a little break in saying they're just growing and learning and trying to understand this world. They don't have the perspective of a 50-year-old, and they're at whatever age they are. So also, it's their life, like, not yours. So while I have certain things I want to instill in my kids, they might not accept all of them, right? They might not want that for themselves. So you got to kind of like let it be and be okay with that, and accept a new perspective or a new scenario for your children, right? So it's an interesting kind of dilemma of like high standards but understanding, we're not even in the ballpark here because X, Y, and Z. There's a million reasons that a kid might think opposite or differently or not want it, or totally just miss the mark unintentionally. Like, that's just the reality of life. And at the same time, this has kind of been on my mind, right? It's like sometimes we think of certain things as being like, oh, such a failure, a bad thing. The only time, like, failures or bad behaviors or things like that really have a lasting negative effect is if we keep it in this certain shame cycle. If we can just like address it for what it is and just be like, well, that sucked, that was dumb, here's all the reasons why I don't ever want to do that again, and here's my plan to never do it again, right? Or basically you can contextualize it in like, this is why it happened, and now we've learned and we're moving on from that, right? Almost anything, like even things that are quite traumatic, can be a learning experience that just gets put in the past and we move forward with a healthy life. When shame about those things come in on it, obviously the more toxic things are, the harder it is to just leave it, contextualize it, make peace with it, and move on. But there's a whole spectrum of toxicity in each kind of behavior or situation or relationship we're talking about. But if you can contextualize it and leave it there and go on, you can get through almost anything. It's when you create shame cycles around them that it becomes really problematic and causes crap in the future. So you gotta like keep that perspective. Like, obviously there's certain things I want my kids to never participate in and never do, but if they do it, I mean, we'll do our best to sort of juggle that thing and move on, right? Because it doesn't have to be detrimental all the time. So anyway, I feel like I'm rambling. In fact, when fathers take the time to play zestfully with boys during their infancy and as youngsters at adolescence, these children often need less guidance from adults when handling difficult feelings and are more capable of handling emotionally intense situations in a graceful and socially acceptable way. He's obviously talking about fathers here as opposed to mothers in the way that they play and communicate with children. A lot of times dads end up wrestling and joking and really exciting the kids. Fathers tend to bring out a whole different spectrum of emotions than mothers do, and it's good to have the contrast between the two because children learn to juggle different scenarios, different personalities, different emotions. And they, apparently these ones help children with difficult feelings on their own later in life. So I thought that was really interesting. Research shows that such father play or enthrallment has many developmental benefits because it forces children, and this is especially significant for young boys, to learn to regulate and tolerate their feelings when interacting with a different special caregiver, to identify these feelings more clearly, and to adapt to a variety of complex situations. Very interesting. and it's all like in a healthy way. Let's see, Santa Clara University, a study done on empathy. And in a study of preschool children and their fathers in Alabama, fathers who were closely involved in the nurturing of their children were shown to have sons with increased self-esteem and low incidence of depression. Along similar lines, the Gluck, study, first undertaken over 4 decades ago with 240 fathers and their sons in the Boston area, and later followed by John Snarley at Harvard, demonstrated that fathers who were supportive of their sons' social and emotional development during their sons' first 10 years of life had boys who excelled in high school and college. And when fathers kept up this nurturing through adolescence, their sons' career success was also influenced positively. Indeed, it is virtually impossible for fathers to be too involved with their sons, bearing any overt misuse of the time together. The more time the fathers stay close to their boys, the better the boys did. Very interesting, and personally I love hearing that, right? Because it's like catering to my preferred lifestyle. Like, I work from home. I spend a ton of time with my kids. I'm a super engaged and I spend a lot of time playing with my kids and helping with homework and doing music with them and things. And so to hear that is exciting to me, right? The more time that I can personally spend with them, the better they're going to do, as long as it's all, in a somewhat healthy way. So very cool for all the dads. And this book's actually written a while back, but even at that time, they noticed that fathers were spending more and more time with their kids than those in previous generations. And I think a lot of that came from, sort of the things that were happening in the world at the time. Like during the World War II time period, where all these, the men in a large part of our society were just removed from the home for quite a while, and mothers took on all these certain duties. And then when those military men returned, there was a new dynamic. And then the children of those people, mostly the baby boomers, kind of had a sort of cynicism, but the fathers were still more engaged than their parents were. And now here we are, another generation down. Studies have shown that parents or fathers specifically are becoming more and more engaged with their kids. So we're getting a better balance of mother-father relationships with children, and it's exciting news. In another 11-year study that followed boys beginning at age 7 to 11 through ages 18 to 22, the more shared activities a boy had with his father, the more education he completed. And the closer the emotional bond between father and son, the lower was the incidence of social delinquency. Indeed, this study showed that fathers had more of an effect on their teenage sons in their academic and social functioning than mothers did. The boys reported receiving greater emotional support from fathers than mothers in well-functioning two-parent families. By contrast, when D'Angelo and colleagues at Case Western Reserve studied over 80 adolescent boys, they found that boys with fathers who had the poorest self-control, boys with fathers who easily lost their tempers, or who frequently acted out in impulsive ways, demonstrated significant difficulties in almost all areas of their lives. These boys had problems doing well at school, even showing up to school, were poor at resolving conflicts in an appropriate way, and found it difficult to get along with their peers. They also tended to have problems with drugs and alcohol, were relatively inept at handling intimate relationships, and tended to be sexually promiscuous. It's crazy the effects that these things have. Ideally, fathers involved in rearing his adolescent son need not include imploring his son to stand on his own 2 feet, spurring him on to become an independent boy man. Instead, fathers need to strike a balance between supporting the boy's growing sense of independence as his sense of the I, as well as a boy's continuing need for connection with both parents, the we aspect that is all a natural and important part of his maturing masculine self. While the boy should be encouraged to explore the bounds of autonomy, he must also be made to feel welcome, to return to dad as well as mom for love, support, and affection to maintain his relational ties. So, last thing that I'll share in this first half. Basically, this is mostly going for the children, but there's a large scale research study on dual earners couples by Barrett Marshall and Wesley College. Fathers' positive relationships with their children was also the best predictor of the men's physical health. So the dad receives better physical health by being engaged with his children. This is kind of unrelated, and maybe I'm taking too big of a leap, but I read this study years ago about elephants. The elephants were getting too populated for the amount of territory that they had been designated to live in. So the plan was remove all the older breeding males away onto a new place, so that would essentially give them, because males don't start mating until they're quite old. I don't remember the age. And that would give them 15 years before the younger males would start mating, and so they wouldn't have any new baby elephants, and a few of the older ones would die off, and it would sort of give them a time frame to work in before they would kind of run into that issue again. Well, what happened is all these young males that were they were too young to really be mating. All of a sudden they had this major spike in testosterone and some weird hormone changes. They got super aggressive. They actually killed some of the rhinos that were living there on the territory. They started becoming sexually active and things. It was this really crazy change. So what they did is brought a few of the older males back, and everything settled back down. The young males went back to sort of the young male role, and everything chilled out. Now, think about the young men in our society who are growing up in that scenario. The young men in certain population sectors in our country that their fathers are completely removed. There's tons of violence, young pregnancies, drug use, low school attendance and graduation, low education, all these things may well be impacted in a big way by the absence of fathers, and we could reverse it with fathers becoming engaged in the lives of these communities. So interesting thought that I think that's what it is, but like I said, maybe I'm just jumping too far. But so this is part 1 of Real Boys. I will do a part 2, because I think all this information is extremely valuable in the parenting world, and that is ultimately the platform which our kids will use as to jump off for their own success. So thank you guys for watching. I'll follow this up with the other half of the book. I appreciate your feedback. Comment below all the things that you're thinking as we go through these things, because this is deep stuff. This is stuff that is extremely important. Parents struggle to navigate so many different pulls from society. In fact, when I brought this book up a while back, it was when I did a review on 1, 2, 3 Magic, which in that book it talks about making a quick break when leaving your kids at school and stuff, and that's the exact opposite that this book says. So I think it's interesting that two professionals in a specific field can have a different opinion and things, and sometimes it's just a matter of what you've actually researched and how, and so it seems like this guy William Pollack is a little bit more knowledgeable on that aspect of parenting, and that's what his expertise is in. So I tend to side with this book on that specific topic. But what do you think? What's your experience? Anyway, we'll talk to you guys later. Thanks.